Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and today we're making an easy floating shelf, and this time, the bracket's made completely out of wood. No steel involved. Check it out. All right, so getting started on this project, I've got this piece of beech live edge slab. I milled this up with my sawmill, and I used this on the floating shelf project and the floating mantle project. And on both of those, I used a method of making the bracket using welded steel. And it's a super strong setup, but not everybody has access to a welder. So we're gonna use this 3/4 inch plywood and this red oak dowel and this little piece of slab to show how you can do this without a welder using just wood. So we'll start by just sort of checking out this piece. And I know the back of this isn't really flat. So I'm gonna go over to the table saw and square this up. And a way to do that, if you don't have, like a jig where you can clamp this, or if your saw doesn't have the capacity, that I'm going to use is I'm just going to take a piece of scrap wood and I'm just going to use a brad nailer and nail it to the front. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me about the same distance to the back of the slab on both sides, and it'll allow me to square this up and run this against the fence. And since I know I'm gonna be cutting the ends off of this because they're both out of square, I can throw a couple nails in there. If you didn't want to use the nails, you could just use some hot glue and hot glue a piece flat to the front of anything that's live edge, as long as it's relatively square, and then use this as your reference against the fence. While we're over at the table saw, we might as well rip our piece of 3/4 inch plywood. So because we want to hide this bracket completely in the material, we want to make it a little smaller than the material is thick. So this material's 2 3/16. So we'll make our piece of material, we'll make it 1 3/4. So there's still a little bit of meat there. Maybe we'll make it 1 5/8. We're gonna make it 1 5/8. 1 5/8, 3/4 inch plywood. I'm gonna leave this little strip on the front just because it makes this a little bit easier to work on. So I cut this at 1 5/8, like I said, and now this is gonna be our wall bracket. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna use this red oak dowel and we're going to put 3 spots through this wooden bracket, and then using this dowel to support this material. Now, very similar to what I did in the steel bracket floating shelf, we're gonna just screw this piece of material right into the shelf itself, and we're gonna do all our work right through this wooden bracket so that everything lines up perfectly when we're done. But in order to make sure we don't make any mistakes in the future, we're just gonna label this. We can put an A over here and an A over there so that there's no chance that we flip this over or spin it around. Simple marks are the best marks, and we're just going to kind of place this on here and throw some screws in it. It's important that this is pretty much even with the top of your shelf, which will be this side, because when you go to put this on the wall, you're going to want to throw a level on this. And if this is out of square and you level this, then your shelf is going to be out of square. If this is pretty much even with the actual top of the surface, you can just throw a level across this. You don't have to do any weird measuring. Now we're going to go over to the drill press, and in order to drill this with the live edge, we're actually just going to clamp a piece of wood to this so it'll keep it nice and flat and square against the drill press table. So if you were doing this on just a square piece of lumber, you wouldn't have to do this whole jig with the 2 pieces of wood, but you can see now this is nice and square, and now when I go over to the drill press, this is going to reference perfectly against the table. Now what we can do is put a couple of marks on this. This piece I just cut randomly is 18 1/2 inches wide, so we'll try for the center of that. And we'll put a mark in the center, and then we'll go, let's say 2 inches in from the side on either side. And we want to put our marks in the center of this piece. Now, an easy way to mark the center of a piece of material is run your finger and do an approximate center, and then without changing your finger, go and do the other side, and then in between those 2 marks is going to be dead center of the material. So I've got a nice little reference mark right there. I can go over to the drill press and drill this in. So this is a 1-inch red oak dowel, and it actually measures pretty close to exactly 1 inch. So we're going to use a 1-inch Forstner bit. And the 1-inch Forstner bit is really just going to get us as far down as it will drill. And then we're going to follow it up with a 1-inch spade bit. We want to be able to get as much depth as we can. So we're going to bring our table up to the highest point possible before we hit the material. So when drilling with a Forstner bit, it's really important that you jog and peck the drill. And the reason is these drills have a hard time clearing chips. So as you get all the way down into a hole, you're making chips, and then the chips are just getting stuck basically on top of this. So if at any point this gets hot and jams, you'll stop this thing dead in its tracks in the hole, and it'll be a real pain to get it out. So I always try to peck a little bit down, a little bit up, and that really allows you to clear the chips effectively without getting stuck. So we've got about a 3-inch hole here, which is good, but we're going to be recessing this 3/4 inch plywood in there by about 7/8. So the hole we have is really only about 2 inches deep. So what we're going to do is we're going to chase this hole with a paddle bit. And now, since we started with a really nice straight perpendicular hole into this material, we can use a paddle bit by hand and just very carefully guide it in there, and it should stay pretty straight. And if it goes a little crazy, that's okay. We do want a little bit of room for this to kind of jam as it goes in. It's already a really tight fit, which we're gonna attend to. Jeez, it's a really tight fit. It's already a really tight fit, which we're going to adjust by taking some of this diameter down. But if we go in there with the paddle bit, it'll just give us a little bit of room at the bottom of that hole to get this down there a little bit further. And what we would like is about a 5-inch depth from here, which would be good. All right, so we've got 3 holes. They're all about 5 inches deep off the 3/4 inch plywood. Now, the dowel that we have, so the dowel fits. but it's very, very tight. And chances are, if you got this on there and there was any swell and humidity, it's never going to come off, even if you were trying to just do a test fit, and that's not great. Now, normally dowels are a little bit undersized. This one happens to be pretty much dead on. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our orbital sander with some rough paper, some 80 grit paper, and we're just going to sand this down in the hopes of thinning it down enough that we can get it in there nice and comfortably. Now, the part that's important here is we want a really tight fit in the actual 3/4 inch plywood itself, because that's going to be our glue joint. So what we're going to do is we're going to mark this out, and we're going to leave sections of it without sanding so that we don't have a problem later where the glue joint is loose. So I'm going to mark out 6-inch sections, and I'm just going to use some blue tape, and I'm going to put some blue tape over some sections so we don't hit them with the sander, and it'll keep them from getting marked up. And this blue tape is a little thicker than 3/4 inch. I think that's pretty good. So we can cut this one off and move over to the next one. That one's good, we can cut it off. That one's really good. So having all 3 of these pegs sanded down so they're a little bit looser of a fit is going to help us overall, but I want to make sure that I put them all back in the same holes. So we've got A on this side. We can spin this around. And we can just label these number 1, number 2, and number 3. And we can take these out. Okay, so we've got our pegs all ground out a little bit. I've got them labeled. Now we got to router this in. So this is 3/4 inch thick, and we're going to want to router it to about 7/8. And there's a really simple, easy way to do this. So I've got this pattern bit here, and this thing will cut 1 inch deep, and it uses this guide bearing to run along a pattern. And we've already got our back plate on here, so we're going to use this actually as a guide for our scrap wood. So we've got some scrap 3/4 inch plywood, and what we're going to do is, using a couple of scrap pieces, we're going to build ourselves a little template that butts right against this with a tiny bit of a gap so that we know it's going to be perfect. You know, with a little bit of guesswork, because the way we're going to fill this piece in, it's going to be perfect. So the gap we leave in between this is important. We want to leave just a small gap on either side, and in the meantime we can take a clamp and throw a clamp on here. It'll just keep this thing together. So leave a couple of gaps around there, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take some material that's the same width as this. This is actually just a cutoff from the 1 5/8, and we're going to butt this in on the sides and screw it in with 1 screw from the top. and then throw another screw down into the actual workpiece, and this is going to give our perfect template. So you can see I've got a little bit of movement around this thing in all directions, which is perfect. And now what we're going to do is just take 2 screws and screw this thing down to the actual back of the workpiece so it can't go anywhere. Now we can take off the actual back plate. And now we've got a perfect recess around our back plate that we're going to be using, so we know it's going to fit every time as long as we use a pattern bit. And what's nice is, I know this seems like a roundabout way, but if you make these back plates the same over and over and over again, you could make this jig permanent and always use it on shelves. Now, using these holes to start, we can actually plunge in and not take up too much material. And we're just going to router this in a couple of passes and really try to get this down to the depth that we want. And what's nice is that we can actually keep going deeper and deeper because the bearing will eventually ride against the routed section that we're doing. Got me, that first pass got me about a little more than 1/2 inch. So we're going to go down a little bit more. Okay, so now I've got a little bit deeper than a 7/8 hole routed in there. I can see this is going to be perfect. Now I have these rounded corners, and I could go in there with a chisel and try to chisel those out, but honestly, it's a lot faster if I just take the sander and round the corners on my actual back plate instead so that it fits. And it's not going to change the strength or anything to put some rounded edges on there. So we can sand these and then make sure that it fits good. And so now this is why it's very important that I labeled the A side, because looking at this is only going to fit back in here one way. And so far it looks pretty good. I see a little bit of interference here, and I think it's just because I didn't sand this corner enough. Much better. We can drop our pegs back in. You can see that we're going to be all right. Now, with this all done, the next part is going to be to glue these pegs in to this board. And the reason that we put this tape on there was so that when we take this tape off, we get a nice tight fit on the back sides of these pieces. You can see that super nice fit. Because this dowel was so true to size, we get a really nice friction fit. It almost turned it into a tapered peg when we sanded it. We're really going to want to back these out just a little bit. I really only need these things to be tight, just the slightest bit. because we couldn't really get super close to that tape with the sander. So if we push these in all the way, what we're going to have is we're going to wind up in a situation where the peg is actually too big to fit all the way into the hole. And now we can see if this setup fits. You can see it's already super, super tight. And if we hadn't sanded those pieces, it's already hard to get it out. If we hadn't sanded those pieces, we would never get this out. So I've got to go ahead and take the sander and actually make these pins a little bit smaller because they're all so tight. So the other thing to think about is that I left all these pins a little bit too long. So we can cut them all down to about 4 inches. And what that's going to do too is it's going to allow a little bit of space in the front. And that space in the front is going to be important because if there's any sawdust or anything in there, once we're all done, we want to make sure that that stuff's not going to be in the way. And we're going to mark all these at 4 inches from the back being where we marked the letter. We can cut all these on the miter saw. Ideally, you would cut these either with a bandsaw or even with a hand saw, just because cutting these on the miter saw can be a little bit dangerous because they're round and they're going to want to spin. But we're going to use this little extra hand thing to make it safe. Use this little third hand thing from Fast Cap and just makes things a little safer. Okay, so we can put our pegs back in. That's a really, really nice fit. That's going to be great on the wall. So what we can do is, I just put that in a little deep. We're going to have to put some screws in there to pull it back out. And if any of the pegs get stuck, you can use a screw in the back. Just try not to split it. And pull it out. Okay, so now that we know that these pegs fit, we know they're going to work. They are sticking out in the back a little bit, but that's okay. They don't have a lot of play in them left and right, which is good, which is why we tried to leave that fit nice and tight. And what we can do now is we can actually glue them. Now, what we're going to want to do is have some sort of alignment protocol because we really don't want these things to move when we glue them. So we're going to use just the tips of these holes to kind of line things up. I'm going to just throw some little blocks under, and that's going to keep this up. And we're going to throw some glue in these joints, pull these together, clean them up really nice so that there's no glue dripping out, and then leave these in here overnight to set up really well. So since we use Type-On 3, it's got a longer setup time, so I don't have to worry so much about this setting up. I can take my time cleaning up the glue, making sure everything is nice, and then we can get these positioned in the holes. You can see how they moved a little bit, and we really want to get these things as close to perfect as possible. So we're going to leave this in there overnight, and that's going to give us a nice registration. Tomorrow when the glue is dry, we'll pull it out, and then we can modify these if we have to do a little bit more sanding to make them fit nice. That won't be a problem. All right, so it's the next morning. We can pull this out. All the glue's set, glued up really well. Throw those blocks away now. We can put this in there, see how it fits. We can take the guide off first because it's going to make it a little less deep to remove it if it does get kind of stuck. So, like I said, if I was going to make a couple of shelves, I could keep this guide, and as long as my bracket, my wall bracket, was the same size, I could use this over and over again. And let's say we were doing a really wide shelf, you could just move this bracket down. You could do one and then move it down and do the next section and really utilize this over and over again. So we've got our nice recess in the back. So as I go to slide this in, I can feel it's already it already kind of wants to tighten up. What I'm going to do real quick before I push this in there is I'm going to put a little bit of paste wax on these red oak pins, and then I'll just help them slide in and out and hopefully keep them from binding up. So a little bit of paste wax on there will help keep these things slick so they don't bind up in there. We can push these in. And you can see it's a super nice fit. Now pulling these out, I am going to have to throw a screw in there just so I have something to grab onto. But if this was on the wall, obviously you could just yank the shelf off. And now the reason that we use plywood here instead of a hardwood is because the plywood is strong in both directions. If you used hardwood and the grain was running in this direction and you put force on it, it could split along that seam and just break. So the next thing we have to do, we have these little back sides of the pegs still sticking out. We've got to get rid of those. Now there's a couple ways to do it. We could use the sander. I'm just going to use a little saw and I'm going to saw them off. It'll be a little bit faster than trying to grind all that away with the sander. You can see this is nice and flush now along the back side, and we can go ahead and do the rest of the finishing that we want to do on the shelf itself. These are a special type of pliers made for pulling out brad nails. You can see you grab and then you leverage out and they always get the nails out. They never break the head off. I'll put a link to these in the description of this video. They're awesome. We've got our bracket for the wall, and I've got my A side over here, which corresponds with my A side back there. And what I want to do is I want to put it into the back of the shelf and just get a center mark on it while it's still on the bench. And what that's going to allow me to do is just make sure that when I put this thing on the wall, it actually goes exactly where I want. So what I'll do is I'll just push this in just till I can just barely see it, and I'll get a quick center. Since I cut the ends after all this work was done, the center might not actually be the center of this piece of material. So now I've got a nice center mark on this. We can write top on this, and now we know when we go and mount this. Now the other thing to do is thinking about the spacing of studs. Now normal stud spacing in a wall is 16 inches on center, which is good because we can just sort of hit 2 studs with this. If we put screws on the sides of our outside pegs. And then what we could do is we could put a couple of screws in the field here and put them in mollies or some sort of a anchor. Before we get over to the wall, I'm just going to drill some countersink holes in this so that we have a nice recess for the screws to go in. We can go over to our wall and hang this thing up. So now that I got the bracket on the wall, I know it's level. Now we just have to get the shelf onto the bracket, which might take a little bit of fine tuning and a little bit of manipulation of these kind of pins. But once we get it on there, it should slide on pretty nice. And it is very, very strong. All right, so that's it. I don't normally put a fastener in the bottom of my floating shelves. I like to be able to actually get them back off the wall if I have to. But if you did want to put a fastener in the bottom, you could just drill a countersink hole in the bottom and put a little screw. And all you would need is one attachment point and it would keep this thing from sliding off. It's pretty good on there. And just to test the strength of this, this is actually a plywood wall that this is screwed into. But I'm going to throw a little bit of weight on here so you can see how it performs. All right, that about does it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I made this because on my other floating shelf videos, people commented that they couldn't get access to the steel or the welder to do it, and they didn't have that skill set. So I wanted to take that concept and interpret it with just wood, and I'm really happy with how it came out. This thing is really, really strong. Every time I go to sag it, I really just get the wall kind of deflecting out with it, which is an awesome sign that this thing would last a really long time. I put about 16 pounds of weight on it just now, and it didn't even deflect the slightest. So like I said, one screw up through the bottom will keep this thing secured onto the pins. And overall, if you've got access to a wood shop, you can build one of these without a huge headache. So if you have any questions, please leave them down below. I'll put links to some of the stuff I use in the description as well. If you want to follow along on a day-to-day basis what I'm doing here in the shop, you can follow me at Make Everything Shop on Instagram. I post every day when I'm in the shop, and I do a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff and answer questions on the fly. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.